on taxation, stability and growth, outlining the country's current tax system, followed by a discussion on how it can be improved going forward. May I invite Dr. Roshan Perera, Senior Research Fellow at the Advocata Institute, onto the stage for the presentation.
Thank you, Sumia. I know you're probably all looking forward to a 40 winks, but hopefully what I'm going to say now will shock you awake, and you won't need to take those 40 winks. So what I will be presenting today is based on a research project I'm conducting with 3 others at the Advocata Institute. Naqiya, who will be actually moderating this session, Tashikla Mendis is also somewhere around, and Janani Vanigaratna, where we are trying to analyze the Sri Lanka's tax system. So this is basically some of the findings from that research project. So taxes basically, taxes are the primary source of revenue for the government, and basically they're vital for more sustainable, and I think we've heard that over and over again in the last few sessions, vital for more sustainable and inclusive growth. And basically, why do governments need revenue? We need to ramp up our investment in education, health, to improve productivity. And I think the president basically mentioned that we need to have better education system. We need to enhance infrastructure. And I think in the last session, we were very much confronted with the thought that we really need to have more taxes in order to address poverty issues, inequality issues, and to support vulnerable groups in society. And I think that came out very clearly during the COVID pandemic shock, where that was not an option for Sri Lanka. But taxation is, again, not only a means for financing for the government, it also underpins, as Stephen Kidd said a few minutes ago, actually, the contract between the state and its citizens. And that's another reason, because it holds, when we pay our taxes, we basically hold our governments accountable. And when we don't feel that we are paying our taxes, or when it doesn't really cause a dent in our pockets, we kind of lose that contract between the state and society. But what has been the experience of Sri Lanka in terms of raising revenue? So over a long period of time, the government revenue has not been even sufficient to cover even our recurrent expenditure. In 2021, we had government revenue of around 8%, but our recurrent expenditure was double that. So how did we finance that gap? Basically, through borrowings. So if you're borrowing even to spend on our recurrent expenditure, then how do we finance our capital expenditure? Basically, we borrow again, right? So this resource, since our resource collection is inadequate to meet the needs of the country, basically we've had to be borrowing consistently, which has led us to this unsustainable debt level that we now are faced with. So that is one of the main reasons that we need to look at this, and that why we are talking about this today. And if you look at sort of spending in relation to even other low developing countries, other emerging market economies, and even advanced economies, you'll find that our expenditure on education and health and even social protection is much lower than many of these other countries. And as we said, I mean, those are areas that really need to be ramped up. So while dealing with this prioritization of expenditure, because as somebody mentioned earlier, we spend more on defense than even in some of these other areas vital for improving productivity and growth. But while improving our spending and our expenditure mobilization, spending patterns, we really need to look at the revenue side. So the problem with this revenue collection has basically got worse over time. the tax to GDP ratio, which was on average about 17% in the 1990s, declined in the 2000s to about 14%. And in the last decade, it was averaged about 11%. And this is in contrast to our per capita GDP, which has basically increased threefold from US dollars 1,300 on average in the 2000s to about 3,600 on average in the last decade. And there are multiple reasons for this declining tax revenue collection. One is our tax policy. We have had very ad hoc changes to tax rates, tax thresholds, a plethora of tax exemptions that has basically narrowed our tax base. But the second issue is also our tax administration. We have multiple revenue agencies, very complicated tax systems with multiple taxes, inadequate use of technology, and basically even a proper monitoring system. And now there are many modern monitoring systems that can be used to basically address the evasion of taxation. And if you look at it across the world as well, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. From this selected list of countries, you'll find that Sri Lanka, the only two countries that are below Sri Lanka are really Bangladesh and Ethiopia. So this again underscores the need to really ramp up our tax revenue collection. So although taxation is a contentious issue, it is widely accepted that a certain level of taxation is required for the government to facilitate sustainable economic growth and basically to provide the essential services to its population to ensure greater inclusion. And the empirical evidence basically points to a positive relationship between tax collection and GDP growth. And from this graph, you can see, advanced economies collect higher levels of taxation compared to developing countries. And there's a study that has been done where basically once the tax to GDP level of a country reaches a certain percentage, so it's about 13%, the real GDP of the country rises sharply, and this is sustained over several years. Hence, what the recommendation is that for countries that have low tax to GDP ratios, they are recommended to aim for at least 15% tax to GDP ratio for at least 15%, so that they can move to a higher growth trajectory. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka, basically you can see that we are far behind this level, which means that we have to significantly ramp up our tax effort. Right? So what we mean by tax effort is actually the amount we collect versus our potential. And this increase in tax collection needs to be achieved, of course, without compromising growth through some well-designed policies to broaden our tax base and basically improve compliance and administration. So one argument that we have heard quite often for a low tax regime is that it will stimulate economic growth, leading to higher revenue collection in the future. However, this depends fundamentally on the elasticity and buoyancy of a tax system. So in our research, we basically did some estimation on the elasticity and buoyancy of the tax system in Sri Lanka. And what I mean by elasticity is basically it's how tax revenue responds to changes in income or economic growth. And if the elasticity is greater than 1, it means that the tax revenue collection, it's elastic, the tax system is elastic, and its response to economic growth is higher. So as economic growth increases, the proportional increase in revenue collection is higher. However, vice versa, if it's less than 1, the tax revenue actually decreases, and there's a threat to fiscal sustainability unless there's some adjustment in spending. So in Sri Lanka, what you've seen is that the tax to elasticity, so we basically calculated it for 3 different periods. You'll see that the tax elasticity has actually declined over time and consistently been below 1, which means that the tax revenue is less responsive to changes in economic growth. And the tax buoyancy, which is the graph on the right, is basically a similar concept. But here we look at discretionary changes. We include the discretionary changes in taxation. That is, taxation collected due to ad hoc changes in taxes or the introduction of new taxes. And what we find there is, okay, it's actually, it's still less than 1, but higher than elasticity, which means that we have been relying more on these ad hoc policy changes to collect taxes, to raise revenue, rather than improving our tax system and our administration. So understanding this is very crucial because it shows that despite the increases in GDP and GDP per capita, the relatively low elasticity and buoyancy of the tax system has led to this decline in government revenue, further sort of reinforcing the need for comprehensive tax reforms. So where is the scope for Sri Lanka to mobilize more taxes? So we looked at 3 main areas where tax effort can be increased. One is in relation to the taxes we consume, so the largest tax, which is the VAT, in relation to what we earn, so income taxes, and we also did something on property taxes, what we own, which I will discuss a little more in detail. So when we look at the VAT, you'll find that this is one of the major sources of revenue around the world, and since its introduction in 1960, there are about 160 countries that have actually, there are very few countries really, or major countries, that have not adopted the VAT. Sri Lanka implemented it in 2002. Sort of it took over what was called the GST, which was implemented in 1998. But what we see is that the VAT to GDP ratio has actually consistently fallen. So we had a VAT to GDP ratio of about 6% in 2004, but it has subsequently declined to 2% in 2021. So this is one of the reasons, or some of the reasons are these frequent changes in VAT rates, revisions to the tax threshold, a plethora of tax exemptions, which have significantly eroded the tax base and hence revenue collection. In addition, of course, there have been administration issues that have contributed to this low tax collection, particularly the lack of use of certain technology to basically assess and to monitor tax VAT receipts. So to assess the performance of VAT, we calculated this metric called the C efficiency ratio, which is a widely used indicator to assess the performance of VAT. And it gauges basically the extent to which VAT has been applied uniformly across the tax base. So even compared to other Asian countries, you can see that the C efficiency ratio in Sri Lanka is one of the lowest, indicating that we have not maximized the revenue collection from this source. And the other, if you look at the graph on the right side, you can see that the C efficiency ratios actually declined over time. So it was 25% in 2010, but now 10 years later, in 2020, it was down to 17%. And in most high-income countries, the C efficiency ratios are usually about 50%. And even in this graph, you can see Japan and Thailand have values of over 50%. So what this implies is the low ratio indicates the level of erosion of the tax base, either a result of number of exemptions, high thresholds, exempting, which means that a large proportion of the economy is exempt from VAT, and which is referred to as a policy gap, or due to enforcement and collection issues, which we refer to as a compliance gap. So much of the literature shows that in the other countries, this policy gap has been the main really reason why this C efficiency ratio has been low. But when we did the analysis and when we disaggregated the C efficiency ratio into the compliance gap and the policy gap, we found that both were significantly had affected the low C efficiency ratio in Sri Lanka, which means that it indicates that we need to improve our policy making in terms of the VAT, but also that the tax collection authorities also have an equally important role to play to improve tax revenue collection. That means like both factors really need to be addressed. So these are again some numbers for you to understand where we stand. Sri Lanka has one of the highest thresholds of VAT in Asia. This was when we had a threshold of 300. Now I think they're subsequently bringing it down, but still, it is still significantly higher than most countries in Asia. And when we increased it to 300 million, we lost something like 70% of the registered VAT players were just wiped out of the system. So now actually they've decided they're going to reduce it to 120 million. But the question is, how did they come up with that 120 million? What was the scientific basis? Will that earn the kind of revenue that we need from VAT? So the question is, we sort of arbitrarily come up with these values, but we really need to have some kind of scientific basics in determining things like the threshold. The other one is the VAT rate in Sri Lanka is also one of the lowest in the history of VAT. So the 8% VAT I'm talking about is the lowest in the history of Sri Lanka, as well as one of the lowest in the region. And another problem is this, as I said, these ad hoc changes in VAT. We have changed, the VAT rate has been revised 6 times since its adoption in 2002, which leads to great uncertainty and difficulties in administration. Now, there are the norm is basically, or the ideal situation is basically that you do not change or you do not tinker with the VAT system once it is implemented. And most countries that have been successful have basically stuck to that. So us, the continuous tinkering with the VAT system has been a huge problem in our VAT collection. And you can see that, but you can see that the rate is not the only issue. Here we calculate something called the effective tax rate. And if you look at the difference between, the standard tax rate is the tax rate that is applied, but the effective rate is actually what you're actually earning based on that. You see that there's a huge gap between the two. And the gap basically shows the number of exemptions, the amount of the economy which is basically outside the tax system. And basically, it highlights a scope to increase revenue collection by expanding the tax base and reducing exemptions, but also improving the tax administration. So that's to do with the consumption taxes. Moving on to income taxes. So we have basically our direct taxes, consumption taxes have been the mainstay or have contributed the most actually to tax revenue. So we've always talked about this, the ratio of direct to indirect taxes have been something like 20 to 80%. The intention has always been to reverse that and to have at least 60 direct and 40 indirect. But we've never been able to really move towards a more progressive system. But I think that is something that we really need to address. Because if you look at the distribution of income in Sri Lanka, you'll find that 20% of households enjoy 50% of the income generated in the economy. So really, the burden of taxation or the higher taxation must be borne by higher income earners. And I think in this crisis, we really need to focus on that because in the previous sessions, we've heard how this crisis is affecting the most vulnerable groups in society. And when you say vulnerable, it's actually not even the first, second, third decile. I think some people are talking about the fifth and sixth deciles also being, at very vulnerable levels. So we really need to move towards this more progressive tax system. But if you look at the right side, you can see what has happened in reality. In reality, what has happened is as per capita income has increased, personal income taxes as a percentage of GDP has actually declined. And there are many reasons for that. Again, if you look at the thresholds, we have very high thresholds. I'm again looking at the threshold that was introduced in 2019 of 3 million, a tax-free threshold of 3 million. Basically, that was 4 times our per capita GDP at that time. Now we are reducing it to 1.2 million, but even then it's about twice our per capita GDP. However, in advanced economies, the threshold is roughly about 0.25%. So we are still much, 4 times more than that. And it is there's evidence that developing countries that have a threshold of over 1%, or 1 times the per capita GDP, have generally failed to raise sufficient revenue and found themselves in very difficult fiscal situation. And here again, you can see why. We have one of the lowest personal tax income rates in much of this region, which has led to this low tax to GDP collection. Moving on to corporate taxes, basically what we see there is, again, this whole thing of exemptions. Corporate income taxes, we have depended on a very few sectors of the economy. So we basically took the 250 companies listed in the stock exchange, and we looked at their tax payments. So, and they account for about 25% of total corporate taxes. The interesting thing we found from that was that the tax was borne by very few sectors. Primarily, the financial services bore a very high burden of taxation. And you had the food and beverages sectors and telecommunications. Everything else was much smaller, so we just lumped them as other sectors. But basically, these were the sectors that really bore a larger proportion of the taxes. And of course, SOEs are also another contributor to taxes. So many sectors of the economy, because they are exempt, are subject to lower tax rates. So, for example, IT, agro-processing, exports, pay very little taxes compared to their contribution to GDP. So if you look at the right, I have showed you the contribution to GDP from different sectors, particularly if you can see construction, real estate, transportation, warehousing activities. Although the contribution to GDP is much higher, they don't really feature very much in terms of tax revenue collection. So this differentiation or differential tax treatments for different sectors basically ends up distorting the allocation of resources. And we've seen that, right? So you basically can see why certain sectors have grown significantly in the economy, because they have had much better treatment in terms of taxes. And also, when you look at the financial sector, we can see the inordinate burden that the financial sector is bearing, which may be something that we need to think about, particularly given what's going on right now in the financial sector and in the economy, because they are bearing a sort of undue burden or a disproportionate burden of taxation. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we'll carry on the conversation during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. And starting off our next panel discussion, joining us virtually is Professor Mick Moore, political economist, founding CEO and senior fellow at the International Center for Tax and Development. And the session will be moderated by Naqiya Shiraz. Over to you, Naqiya.
A warm good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sumi, for that warm introduction, and thank you, Dr. Roshan, for that very insightful presentation that I'm sure will be the foundation for our discussion today. Also, I would like to have a warm welcome to Professor Mick Moore. Thank you for joining us today, Professor. And to our audience who is joining us today in person and online, very welcome to you all as well. A few housekeeping rules before I hand over the mic to you, Professor. We will be trying to take as many questions as we can towards the end of the presentation. So please think through your questions while the discussion is going, and I will try to take as many as possible at the end of the discussion. Professor, over to you.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. Can you hear me, Naqiya?
Yep, loud and clear, Professor.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon. I am just going to make a few comments that follow on from this excellent presentation by Dr. Perera. But let me start by emphasizing again her first point. it's hard to exaggerate the challenge that Sri Lanka now faces in relation to taxation. And this is not just a challenge of finding enough revenue to pay for things like education. There is something which is much more immediate. Unless the government of Sri Lanka commits to a credible path to very, very significantly increase the proportion of GDP that's collected in tax, well, no one is going to lend the government of Sri Lanka any more money because they don't think they'll get their money back. So this is very urgent. And actually, Sri Lanka faces a task now in increasing the total tax take, which is bigger than any other country, to my knowledge, has successfully achieved in recent years. So this is enormous. And it's not just a quantitative task, it is also challenging for political and administrative reasons. It's worth pointing out that Sri Lanka historically, that's to say from independence until around 1990, was in fact a fairly high tax economy. But that was not because most Sri Lankans were used to paying a lot of tax. It was a high tax economy principally because the companies that owned tea and rubber and were exporting were contributing a large proportion of taxation. And when that source of revenue disappeared and export earnings disappeared, the new sources of export earnings, which are basically tourism and garments, developed in a situation of very major tax exemptions. And so they never got used to paying taxes. So we have a kind of a very deeply ingrained habit to deal with. But there are also, as Dr. Perera said, very significant issues of tax administration. It's fair to say that tax administration in Sri Lanka has received very little sustained attention from ministers of finance since the 1970s. That's a very long time. And the situation has been allowed to drift. The positive side is that there are enormous possibilities for improving tax administration. But it's worth emphasizing there is one risk here. The government that was elected in 2001 to 4, 20 years ago, did pay attention to the structure of tax administration, but unfortunately did this in a very unconstructive way by simply declaring almost overnight some major reforms in the structure of tax collection without consultation. And these were openly rejected. They generated a lot of resistance, and nothing has been done since. So anything done on tax administration has to be done carefully, and I suggest with a great deal of consultation with the people who know most about tax administration, which is our national tax collectors. So something needs to be done about tax administration. But there is another equally important consideration here, which is what you might call the political narrative. Given the situation in Sri Lanka, and given the high level of distrust of governments, it is an enormous challenge to increase tax collection. And if it's going to be done, I think it's absolutely essential that it's done in a way that is fair, is seen to be fair, and is done and consistent with a narrative that the government presents of exactly why it's increasing taxes and what it's intending to do. And I think that's very important, and I see no sign currently, frankly, that government has any idea of what that narrative would be. I'm going to conclude by making a few comments on some quite specific issues of that fairness agenda. The first one, I was talking not many weeks ago to Mr. Samaranayake, who is the CEO of the Institute of Taxation in Kerala. And he mentioned, while we were talking about personal income tax, how rare it is for him to actually meet anyone who is now a payer of personal income tax. Personal income taxpayers are an endangered species. And the disappearance of personal income taxpayers is a threat to the whole economic ecosystem of Sri Lanka. The reasons are those that Dr. Perera gave, that the threshold for paying income tax is just enormously high in Sri Lanka, as well as exemptions. So that is a major issue that needs tackling. The second issue, which is also emphasizing what Dr. Perera told us, is that the Sri Lankan tax system is characterized by a very large accumulation of business tax exemptions, some of which date back decades, many of which seem to be rather obscure. We have very little information on these. And they benefit some sectors of society, some sectors of business more than others. I think a major effort is going to be needed to identify business tax exemptions and justify any which should be continued. And this relates to another issue, which is an ideological issue. There is a great risk that any progress on tax collection gets undermined by ideological debates between whether the corporate taxation should be higher or whether it should be lower. And that is actually not a very constructive debate to have. And I hope Sri Lanka will avoid that debate as far as possible. Because as Dr. Perera has shown very well, the problem is not that corporates in Sri Lanka pay particularly low taxes overall. They certainly don't pay high taxes. But the problem is enormous inequities between different sectors of the economy and different companies. And that's the issue that needs tackling. The third point also mentioned by Dr. Perera, we need serious real estate taxes. The amount of wealth in Sri Lanka that is now embodied in real estate, especially residential real estate in the Western province, is just enormous. Any notion of fairness implies that there should be some kind of tax on this wealth. A full wealth tax is very difficult to construct, couldn't be done for some time, but a serious tax on residential wealth would be a great contribution to fairness overall. My final point is that let's not be frightened of value-added tax. Again, there's an ideological issue here. A value-added tax is essentially a tax on final consumption. There's a very standard story. So it's a tax on consumers, and therefore it hits poorer consumers harder than richer consumers. It's very convincing, and it's often simply wrong. A well-designed value-added tax that exempts key products purchased by consumers, especially food, can be, in fact, a very fair and equitable. And as Dr. Perera said, the value-added tax is the big growth tax in the world. It's a great way of collecting revenue, and it's a great way of improving economic efficiency. Sri Lanka has a value-added tax, but it is almost the shadow of a value-added tax. So that needs reforming and improving, and provided that's done in a way that protects poor people, we do not need to be frightened of that issue. And Naqiya, that's all I need to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very, very insightful presentation. Well, while I would love to delve into the specific points that both of you made in your presentations, I would like to start with a question that I think most of us do have on our minds today. Dr. Roshan, I think I'll focus the question to you, and then Professor, if you would like to make remarks after, please go ahead. My question is, how feasible is it at a time like this, given Sri Lanka's economic crisis and the reasons why we are all here today at a conference like this, is to increase taxes, given everything that's happening? And is this a necessary option, or has it just been something that has been a long time coming?
So I think that's a really good question. I think the bottom line is, if you want growth, there'll be no growth without macroeconomic stability. And it is widely accepted that the root cause of our current macroeconomic instability is the lack of fiscal discipline. And we really need to address not just fiscal discipline, the fiscal deficit. And we really need to address that fiscal deficit. So there, as I said in my presentation, there's some possibilities to rationalize expenditure from unproductive areas to more productive areas, but that will only take us so far. The main focus, I think, has to be on, not only me, I think most economists would agree, has to be on revenue mobilization. And this requires basically very wide-ranging tax reform, or a real focus on tax reform, which is based on some kind of scientific analysis of what taxes need to be revamped and how it should be done. And that's where we really need a team or where we actually sit down and look at the numbers and see what is going to get, how much do we need in order to bridge this deficit? Because basically we are going into a program with the IMF. The IMF will give us some targets, and we need to be realistic in terms of how we're going to meet those targets. Consistently, if you look at budgets, you'll see that the estimates for revenue have never been met because they are not based on scientific analysis. It's just some number that has been picked out of a hat, and consistently we have never met those revenue targets. So this has to be done in a much more scientific way because we cannot get it wrong. We basically have to meet those targets if we want to get out of this crisis, if we want to continue to be within the program. But what I would like to say is this tax reform, so depends on sort of three things. One is, what is the revenue that we need? What is the institutional capacity that we have? Because we have to work with what we have now. And over time, yes, we need to develop it. We need to make it much more modernized. But we need to work with the institutional capacity we have now. And it also depends on what people are willing to accept. Because even if people are going to be asked to pay higher taxes, they need to know what you're going to do with that income. There needs to be transparency in terms of how that extra fiscal space is going to be used. And you need to be able to convince people, and this is where that social contract comes in. And I think that Stephen Kidd had a really nice diagram on that. If people are going to pay more taxes, you need to be providing them with the services that they require for their survival, but also for the businesses or whatever to grow. So I think that is very important. So I think we need to convince the stakeholders that reform is necessary, but when we are doing that reform, it must be in the interest of everybody.
Dr. Roshan, if I could just jump into the next question and ask you on tax exemptions. I think you mentioned this in the presentation, and Professor Moore also briefly touched on this. So since liberalization, in order to attract foreign investments, consecutive governments have offered tax incentives. First, it was under the GCEC Act, then the BOI in the 1990s, and then the tax incentives are also offered under the Inland Revenue, and most recently under the Strategic Development Project Acts of 2008. My question is, are tax exemptions the way to attract investment into Sri Lanka, or what are the other factors that governments should look at in order to attract FDI?
Yes, so I think this ties in with the whole analysis of why companies don't pay many, the taxation is sort of concentrated in certain areas. So basically Sri Lanka and many countries have used tax incentives to attract foreign investment. or investments really into specific regions and sectors. And there are certain reasons why that might be valid, where basically where the returns may be less than the social returns are higher than private returns. You might need to give some kind of incentive to attract these investments. What we're but it is increasingly recognized that tax incentives are not the most important factor. I mean, there have been surveys done to show that basically there are other factors which are much more important than tax incentives. So, like your doing business environment, your access to good labor, productive labor force, the infrastructure that you need to carry out business. So those factors are much more important than even tax incentives. And also we need to be clear about, we've given all these tax incentives, but have we ever done an analysis, sort of a costing of what these incentives have cost to the economy? I think in the last IMF program, we had some kind of a move towards that to try to do this, tax expenditure analysis, which never really it never got off the ground. But I think that is very important, that we need to do that analysis, and basically you need to figure out, because fiscal costs of these tax exemptions are very high, and it reduces the financing that you have. Basically the alternative that you could spend those taxes on. So you really need to do that cost-benefit analysis and see whether it is something that is worthwhile for the entire economy. Hello? And not only particular sector.
Are you able to hear me? It may be a little bit faint, but can you?
The other problem is basically in Sri Lanka, as you mentioned, we have these multiple incentive regimes. So we've had the BO, we had the Inland Revenue Department, we have the BOI, and now we have the Strategic Development Act, all under which you can actually give these these kind of exemptions. And there's some kind of lack of transparency as to the basis for how these tax exemptions are actually given out. And these have also created, opportunities for rent seeking and a lot of misuse of this discretionary power that is given to these multiple agencies. So I think that's another area that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think there has to be really clear targets, clear idea of who should be eligible for these tax exemptions, and it has to be a conversation that is at the policy level. It shouldn't be the discretion of a bureaucrat or somebody who's in charge of those. It must be a strategic decision as to which sectors or which companies are given this, and there has to be some kind of scientific basis on which this is done.
Thank you, Doctor. And I think you've raised really important questions that we need to answer before we make policy decisions. I'm wondering if Professor Mick Moore, if you're there and we can hear you.
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you, Professor. Back to question one, if we don't mind, back to the question on feasibility given our current crisis and tax policy.
Yeah. Well, this is by far the most important single question in Sri Lanka at present, both in terms of tax and economic policy and the future. And I mean, the short answer to this is there really is no alternative. And that's literally true. There's no alternative, because no one is going to lend money to the government of Sri Lanka until it has a credible plan to raise enough revenue that it can repay in future. And regardless of whether this is the IMF or anyone else, it will not happen. And in fact, in practice, until the IMF agrees to a loan, no one else is going to loan very much. China maybe a little bit, but we don't know. So there is no choice. And I mean, this is a little bit like, let's go back to February this year. People in government said, no, of course we don't have a problem meeting our debt repayments in dollars. We've got plenty of money coming in. It's not a problem. When everyone else knew it was a problem and a major problem. And the situation we face now with tax is the same thing. I mean, there really is not an alternative. If the government doesn't start raising more revenue and have a credible plan to continue doing that in a major way, well, there will not be an IMF agreement, and there will not be much foreign exchange, and everything else will be absolutely chronic. And I mean, this is a very, very harsh message, and is one which, unfortunately, most people in Sri Lanka, I think, do not appreciate. And the sooner the government and other people start a serious program of public education to explain how serious the issue is, the better we will be.
Thank you, Professor. If I could also direct the next question to you, and this is regarding tax administration, like you mentioned briefly in your presentation earlier. So the way I think I'd look at tax policy is twofold. From a policy angle, which I think we have discussed extensively so far, and we will continue to do so, but also from an administrative point of view, which you mentioned. Both are equally important, but if I was to focus on the latter to you, Professor, given your extensive experience working with developing countries in Asia and in Africa, how important is tax administration efficiency for a country? But more importantly, in your research and experience in Sri Lanka, what, in terms of tax administration, are the main issues that you see?
Okay, thank you, Naqiya. Well, there is a saying amongst tax specialists that tax administration is tax policy, which is another way of saying you can have the fanciest tax policy you want in terms of legislation, but unless you have a good system for actually implementing that, then you might end up with a policy that is in practice very different from the one you want. So that's a general point about the importance. The second point is that, as with so many other areas of life, the technology and organization of tax collection has been changing very consistently over recent decades. And that has not happened in Sri Lanka. It is unfortunately the case that compared to, for example, most countries in Anglophone Africa I'm familiar with, the tax system in Sri Lanka looks antiquated, absolutely antiquated. Um, there's no one thing that needs to be done. It needs a lot of attention of different kinds. And it is not a good idea for me or anyone else to sit here and say you need to do X, Y, and Z, because we really need to do this carefully and consultatively and work out what are good paths to improvement. But there is certainly, I mean, I'm going to mention two or three things. I'm only going to talk about the Inland Revenue Department because in some ways I think that has got more immediate scope for reform. Uh, it has a software system called RAMIS, which has been in place since 2016 and 2017 and is deeply unfit for purpose. There is no excuse for having that in a contemporary tax administration. It's fixable. I don't know quite what the problem is, but the fact is no one has been concerned to fix it. The staff of the Inland Revenue Department, very unusually in the contemporary world, are not actually recruited with accountancy qualifications. So you are recruiting people afresh who do not have the same basic qualifications as the people in companies they are dealing with. They have lesser accounting qualifications. There is no IT cadre within the Inland Revenue Department, so they depend on a sort of range of odd people to try and fix their IT problems. Um, and it's quite striking that the tenure of the people at the top of the IRD typically are there for a year, 18 months, and move on. If there is a good Director General, that person's tenure is not extended to allow them to introduce reforms. But there are many other things, and I'm not saying these are the key issues. But frankly, someone needs to look properly at this. No one has ever done that.
Thank you, Professor. If I just ask one or two last questions, and then I will open up into questions from the audience. I'd like to focus on the real estate and property taxes that the both of you mentioned in your respective presentations. Would you be able to elaborate on this type of tax? Like you said, it is there's a lot of untapped potential, and how do you see it playing out in Sri Lanka? Dr. Roshan, if I could direct this to you first.
Okay, so I think land taxes is something that we have not really looked at very carefully in Sri Lanka. But from very early economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo provide very strong justifications for these kind of taxes. It's basically a good source of revenue. It's relatively straightforward. You know who bears a tax because it's the owner of the land. Can be relatively easily identified. So it's basically a good source of revenue. It's progressive. I think Professor Mick spoke about that because it's paid by those who actually own lands. And it cannot be evaded, or you cannot necessarily shift the burden of that tax onto somebody else. The other one is it's considered to be less distortionary because you really can't shift economic activity to another location or to change the economic activity to pay less taxes. So again, that's another advantage of land taxes. And it also encourages the use of land in a more productive way. And you have less idle lands. If they are, if you are forced to have to earn the revenue in order to pay these land taxes. But in Sri Lanka, yes, we do face some challenges in terms of implementing these land taxes. One is we don't have this centralized land registry, and the land registries that are in existence are very messy. So when I say you can easily identify the landowner, it may not necessarily be the case in Sri Lanka, but it can be fixed. We tried to fix it, but it didn't happen. The other one is, of course, there are difficulties in valuing land. Again, Sri Lanka has a problem there. But again, something that can be fixed. It's not something that can be fixed. But then why are they very unpopular? I mean, they are very unpopular. And why? And this is not only in Sri Lanka, it's basically around the world. There's strong opposition to land taxes, and it mainly comes from those who own the land, the landowners, the property owners, because they are the ones who really have greater influence over public policy. But I think given this current crisis, we need to be looking outside the box. We need to looking at all possible sources of revenue. And I think this is low-hanging fruit that we really need to consider, and we really need to try to come up with some kind of land tax, hopefully in the next budget.
Thank you, Doctor, for your very interesting insights. Professor, would you like to take over and add your comment?
I would, yes. This is a tax that could actually be introduced, a serious tax, in a relatively short period of time once legislated. As Dr. Perera said, we don't have a good land registry, and for that reason, I would focus on urban residential property in the Western Province, and then maybe later some other urban areas. But nearly all the potential revenue here is from urban residential property in the Western Province. So I think that's the target. There are many ways these days of using IT to quickly identify and value properties without going into the very fine differences in valuation that characterize the kind of old colonial systems. Other countries are doing this. And so you could quite easily set up an agency to do this, and within a year, with a bit of commitment, you could be raising some very, very significant revenue. Lots of technical advice available from other places in the world about how to do this. Let's do it.
Thank you, Professor. If I can ask one last question before I open it up. We talked a lot about VAT, and I think this is a very important topic that we need to address today. So VAT is a large and a growing revenue source in most countries. Given the indirect nature of the tax, how much of a problem do you believe that VAT regressivity can have in Sri Lanka? Can you comment on the fairness of a VAT given its indirect nature? Professor, would you mind, Doctor, would you like to take the question first?
Okay, so we can't get around the fact that consumption taxes are regressive. But maybe they're not as regressive. I think Professor Mick said everybody's scared of increasing these consumption taxes. But it may not be as regressive as we think they are. So basically, let me give you an example. I mean, if we all consumed all the income that we earned, basically it would be a tax which is basically stable across different income levels. So if whether you're earning 1,000 rupees or you're earning 10,000 rupees, if there's a VAT rate of 10%, basically, and you're consuming everything that you earn, everybody will be paying the same tax. It'll be 10%. The problem arises only when you start earning higher incomes and you start saving a portion of what you're earning. So, for example, if you're earning 1,000,000 rupees, then you may save, consume 800, and then you're saving 200,000. Sorry, then your effective tax rate comes down to 8%. So, 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 so it all depends on the distribution of income, actually, how regressive a tax is. But as Professor Mick also pointed out, there are ways in which you can mitigate this regressivity of the tax. There are some traditional methods which I think he mentioned. You can have higher thresholds so that you eliminate very small businesses and retailers where you expect the more sort of low income earners may actually patronize. You could also have exemptions or low tax rates on goods that are consumed more by low income earners. But there are problems with that because we've seen that in Sri Lanka many times, right? You've reduced the tax rate, you expect this to be passed on, the benefit of this to be passed on to consumers by lower prices. It doesn't really happen. The retailer finally gets a benefit of the lower tax rate. So I don't think that's a very effective tool, really, of addressing inequality and or rather the regressivity. Because and the second thing is, of course, that rate applies to everybody. So whether the people who consume more of that good actually benefit even more because they are paying a lower tax rate on those commodities, and it results in huge losses of revenue to the government, which you've seen in the slides that I presented. You have seen that. So now actually there are sort of modern ways of addressing this regressivity, and that is more to do with basically cash transfers, or you raise the tax whatever you need through your taxes, but you provide the services and the cash transfers to address the inequality issue. So you don't mix the two. Taxes are meant for raising revenue, but you use the taxes that you earn to basically provide these services and social safety nets, and that way you address the inequality.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Moore, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, thank you. Just two or three quick comments. I probably am slightly more enthusiastic about VAT than Dr. Perera is, because I think on the whole, poor people can be protected by exempting food and a few other key commodities, children's clothes, bus fares, the kind of thing that poor people spend a lot of money on. But I would make two other points related to VAT. One is a very technical point, but it is worth making here. The great thing about VAT from the point of view of the tax collector is that the VAT generates an enormous amount of information about businesses. And efficient tax collection is basically an information business. The revenue agencies in Sri Lanka have very little information about the economy. So a good VAT system has side benefits in terms of generating information that can help with the collection of other taxes. But the last point I would make, and this is a great case for VAT, as Dr. Perera said, if you raise significant amounts of money through VAT, even if a lot of burden falls on poor people, if you spend that money to benefit poor people, then they're still better off than they would be without VAT. We can't look at the efficiency of the tax system alone. We have to look at the efficiency of both government revenue raising and government spending. And we have, some of you might have seen today's newspapers, the publication from the Verite Research Institute, showing how household electricity bills alone are a very good indicator of poverty. So the government of Sri Lanka could quite easily now introduce a serious cash transfer scheme, initially targeted only on people whose average household electricity bill is less than 60 kilowatt hours per month, and use an enhanced VAT system to pay for that cash transfer. Um, that's it.
Thank you, Professor. Before I hand over the mic to any last concluding comments to Dr. Roshan and Professor Mike, is there any questions from the audience that we would like to take? Can we get some mics here, please? Okay.
Thank you, Naqiya. I learned a lot from Roshan's. Yeah, I learned a lot from Roshan's presentation. I have two comments, maybe questions, right? Your tax buoyancy rate and tax rate, the dramatic decline occurred over the last 1.5 decades. And I think one of the reasons behind this decline is an important structural change within the economy, right? Because of the debt fuel growth, actually it was the services sector, the non-tradable sector, basically construction, utilities, and various other services that expand during that period. Say 2020, for instance, Sri Lanka had an unusual 80% of GDP coming from these Mickey Mouse services sectors. Taxable possibility of non-tradable is particularly less compared to others. Therefore, I would say one of the reasons for this structural shift has been a structural change in the economy during that period. Perhaps you can check it. The second question, this maybe shows my ignorance, I want to learn about it. In India, a few years ago, there was this big debate about whether to introduce VAT or sales tax. Then economists like Arvind Panagarya, they argued one important point that Mick Moore mentioned, value-added taxation is very information intensive. You need a lot of information. Secondly, relating to the point I made, is that in India, non-services sector had been expanding vastly. Introducing VAT to services and non-tradable sectors is much more difficult than to tradable sectors. Because of this reason, India decided to introduce sales tax, not value-added tax. And one of my colleagues who study taxation, Raghavendra Jha, my colleague, he has found that this was a very valid decision. And because of that reason, their tax buoyancy has increased over the last 2 years. I think we have some lessons to learn from the Indian experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. And we will certainly look at the structural change because I think that is a very relevant point, actually. So even Sri Lanka used to have this BTT, the business turnover tax, and when they converted to the GST. So one of the reasons really why they did that was because of this whole thing of cascading effect, a tax on tax. And you're basically paying taxes at different points. So that was one reason why they changed that, because it had certain distortionary impacts because people, businesses were paying tax on tax. And the value-added tax, the beauty of it is basically you are only taxed once, potentially. But with exemptions, that doesn't necessarily happen because, again, you distort the tax system. So that's why exemptions really should be kept to the minimal. The other thing is it also has this destination principle, which is very good because you basically tax based on destination. So only consumption within the border and not outside. So basically you don't tax your exports. And again, that is very good because for a country like this, who are trying to encourage our exports, we don't have, so the VAT again has that advantage. where it's based on the destination principle. But I think you're completely right, and we have kind of, in a sense, distorted it because we have financial services VAT and a wholesale and retail trade VAT, which most countries actually avoid because of the problem of you don't want to have uh, tax using value-added tax to extract taxation from those sectors is actually problematic, and most countries actually avoid that. But we have gone and introduced these things that there are other problems because of the introduction of those taxes on services. But thank you very much. I think
I've got a question here, please. Hello. I'm here.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I think we have run out of time for questions. However, I believe the presentations will be made available. And if you have any questions after the event, I'm sure we'll be happy to take any comments and discussions further. Dr. Roshan is in the house today. Professor Moore, if you are there, and would you like to conclude today's discussion with any parting words of advice to end today's discussion?
Okay, thank you. I'm not going to try and conclude generally, but let me give my answer to the last question, because I think my answer in some ways encapsulates the issues in Sri Lanka at present. Now, it's certainly true that economists and tax specialists spend a long time debating whether some kind of sales tax or some kind of VAT is better for particular countries. But I would submit, and I'm sorry if this is a sort of rather simplistic answer, I think that is not very relevant for Sri Lanka today. The fact is, Sri Lanka replaced business turnover tax with VAT and then has made a mess of it, in the sense of VAT has been not taken seriously and full of exemptions. I don't think we're in a situation now where we need to be thinking about perfection and refinement and what is absolutely the best system. We need to take what we have, which is VAT, which is legislated, see if it needs any legal changes, but focus on administering it better. And I would say that should be a kind of guideline for a great deal of what needs to be done in Sri Lanka over the next few years in relation to revenue. We're not living in a perfect world. We're living in a very imperfect world, but we need to make the best of that imperfect world very fast.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Roshan, would you have any last words?
Just to conclude, I think we cannot get around the fact that we have to have a very comprehensive reform of our tax system. We need to go back to basics. The principles of taxation, what are the principles? We need to have an efficient tax system. We need to have, so that it minimizes distortion on economic behavior. It needs to be an equitable tax system. So we need to focus more on progressive taxes, on taxing those who earn a higher income. But we also need to have a simple tax system, something that is easy for people to comply with, but also easy to administer. So I would just end with that.
Thank you, Dr. Roshan. Thank you once again, Professor Moore, for taking the time to join us in today's discussion. Thank you to our audience that are both present in person and online. Please continue to enjoy the rest of the conference and have a good evening.